Welcome to the Soul Grit podcast. I'm Ann Taylor McNeese, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also love Jesus, and I'm passionate about all things gospel and therapy. I created Soul Grit to be at the intersection of mental health and Christian faith. Christ followers need a place to ask questions and get answers about mental health. Join me as we dive into real stories and real questions from people who want to honor God with their hearts, souls, and minds. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Soul Grit podcast. I'm Ann, and I'm here today with my friend Brenna Rubio. And I've known Brenna since my Stanford days, so she can remember me as a teenager.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But she's here today as like my guest and as a pastor of a church in Long Beach, right?
Yeah. A sweet little church called City Church of Long Beach.
Well, welcome, Brenna. I would like you to introduce yourself a little bit. What would you like to
Yeah.
share with us about you?
Oh man, yeah. So I am a pastor, as you just said. I'm a co-pastor, which not everybody is kind of aware of that as a model, but it just means that my friend and co-pastor Bill White, we share leadership equally together, bringing in different gifts to the church where we serve at. And yeah, like I said, it's a pretty small, quirky little congregation, which we love. We actually are hoping never to get too big. That there's this sense of like there's a lot of freshness and kind of freedom in having a small church and really just getting to have this the word organic used to be used too much around churches. I haven't heard it as much lately, but I'm like, now that it's like not a trend anymore, I feel like I can reclaim it and say like, there actually is some like cool stuff about like having this really organic, like whatever gifts you bring, that's the kind of church we'll be.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Well, as I said, I've known you for a long time. We haven't had much contact in our adult lives. Well, I guess we were adults, but like grown up.
we were those like sort of just like prototypes of the adults we were going to be at that point. Yeah.
When I was in probably my junior year of college, you got married to your husband, Israel, who's
very early. We were babies.
Yeah, so also a great friend. And I remember attending your wedding. And do you remember what was special about that?
I remember that you caught my flowers that I'd had in my hair. Like that was what I used for my toss. And then you did, in fact, get engaged pretty soon afterwards.
I did. What month was your wedding in?
May.
Okay. And I got engaged in July. So
yes, like it worked in that case.
It worked. I mean, that's like that old wives' tale superstition kind of thing. But in our case, it worked. Mm-hmm. You got married, then I got engaged. So thanks, Brenna.
No worries. I think it may have somewhat worked for my husband too. He threw a baseball because I thought the garter thing was really strange. Yeah. But he threw a baseball, and I think it might have taken a couple more years, but I do think the guy who caught it was like probably the next to get married.
That's so funny. And we were also babies. So here's to getting married young.
Sometimes it works.
And you're also a mom of 4 little ones.
Well, yes. Sometimes I'm still not sure how that happened, but yeah, number 3 turned out to be number 3 and 4.
Yes. Twin mama.
Yes. And
I remember the other time we had contact in our grown-up lives was when I sent you my cloth diapers. So we went through that adventure.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And then I had twins and said, okay, there are a few things that I can simplify. Yeah. I'm sorry, Earth, but this is one of them.
Yes. Okay. Well, good times. I wanted to invite you here to talk today because there's this buzzword that depending on what side of Christianity you kind of land on, you may be familiar with it or maybe not, because I've talked to some people recently who don't know this term deconstruction, but it's your bread and butter. So
it is my bread and butter. Yeah.
I wanted to invite you here. And when we were having our discussion ahead of time for this conversation we're going to have today, you mentioned to me that you were concerned that my audience is going to be more theologically conservative than you are. And I said, Brenna, I don't care because I do care that my audience is conservative, but I don't mind having different kinds of voices here on the podcast.
Right. Well, and that part of my concern even with that is that sometimes it feels like people want us to be angry at each other if we're on different sides, or maybe we might even say like kind of approaches. I like the word approach, right?
Yep.
Because it's a little bit more like we're on a journey, right? This is where we currently are,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this is where we're starting from, and we're all in movement, right? But so the worry was like, hey, Anne, if we have like just like a good conversation, right? Like, is it going to offend people almost like that you weren't rougher, on the heretic?
I didn't straighten you out, huh?
Right? Yeah.
Okay. So I guess I'm just like preempting this conversation with this just disclaimer that Brenna and I have different theology.
Mm-hmm.
However, the parts that we agree on are loving God, Jesus is the way to salvation, and we love people.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
This
and
kind of love Jesus, love people. I mean, at the very bare bones. Mm-hmm.
yeah. And I'm sure there's more that we actually agree on, but those are the foundational truths that we can agree that Jesus is the way and that people are here for us to love. And your expression of that is probably going to be different than mine. Like I described to you that while I'm theologically conservative, I'm more socially liberal than maybe some others who hold my same theology.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you are, I think you called yourself a progressive. Is that how you described it?
It's really weird. We're all still trying to figure out the nomenclature right now. Like, how do we actually, like, what is this thing? I think sometimes people like we could talk about being a progressive Christian. I think that's one way. I'm becoming more and more like there's something about the term post-evangelical that is, I think, in some ways just kind of honoring of like even like, hey, our story, Anne, like we have this same actual kind of starting place.
Yeah.
Right. And to be able to kind of name like, yeah, that was sort of like what I grew up in spiritually. And there are actually still pieces of it that I really am like, I love, and that even makes this like today, like a friendly conversation, right? Like this is me reaching back to what was my community. And in some ways, I actually still feel some sadness that I actually feel a little bit like, I don't think the community wants me, and so it's not just that I'm sort of leaving, I sort of am, but also this feeling of the community wanted me to move on a little bit too, but so what I like about that term post-evangelical is that it at least honors kind of the story and the almost like heritage, right? The history. Yep. Yeah, that's a good word.
So tell me a little bit why you think evangelical has become kind of a bad word lately.
Oh, even when I claimed the term evangelical more firmly for myself, right? I think all along I've had some concern, right? Of just like how I'm going to put myself back in the we for now, right? I'm going to put myself back in my sort of evangelical shoes and say, oh, how we do this in so many ways, how we sometimes try to present ourselves as answer people, as opposed to people who are comfortable with questions and exploration, and the damage that can do to actual relationships. I think that's been a problem for a long time. I think in the current season, there's also just all sorts of just awareness around, hey, what does it mean to follow Jesus in some of these bigger social issues, right? So what you're talking about, right? So, hey, socially, I might actually be kind of progressive. And so I think a lot of people asking questions saying like, if you follow Jesus and if we actually take this Jesus that we read about in the Bible seriously, how can you then turn around and do all these other things or say these things, embrace these political agendas? So I think just there's this sort of like wrestling with this like tension between the Jesus of the Bible and the ways that some evangelicals are following Jesus in the public sphere.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's like,
how do you resonate with that? I mean, does that feel fair to you?
I think I had probably a more positive experience of evangelicalism than most people. I had really healthy parents who kind of did their work of figuring out like, so we believe this church stuff or this doesn't work or, and they raised me to be comfortable with questions and to really dig into the word of God to find my answers. And knowing that my experience was mostly positive, even like with purity culture and like other things that people are saying, ooh, this is a not good part of Christianity. I'm like, well, actually it worked for me,
It's okay for you. Yeah.
And so I've had a positive experience, but I think maybe my experience, like living in the Bay Area, attending Stanford, attending my seminary in the Bay Area, being a therapist, being exposed to other people who are dealing with the hurts and wounds of humankind, like it's made me more aware of the hurt that has been done in the name of Christianity or of evangelicalism.
Yeah.
And so yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, Nadia Bolz-Weber has this wonderful image that she uses in her book called Shameless. And talks about like when you're flying over, you're flying and you see like crop circles, right? And that for the longest time, she didn't know where those came from. That you see these perfectly laid out fields and there's like the center green circle and then the edges that are brown. And I mean, to realize that there's, the fact that the irrigation system is set that way, right? So there's a circle that get watered and then there's the brown edges. And she has this great visual saying like, this is kind of what the church is, the evangelical church in particular, that there is a big area, that the water hits. And so if it works for you, it works for you. But what about those people on the edges and in the corners? And shouldn't we listen to their voices? And shouldn't we be concerned about their experiences? And so, as you said, this is my bread and butter, because the kind of people who tend to come to City Church Long Beach are the people either in the corners themselves or people that they love and care about are in the corners. And they just refuse to go to a church that doesn't minister to them, that isn't welcoming and helpful for them, for the people on the margins.
It's a really great image. And like for me, I was a person in the green circle. I mean, I'm hetero, cisgendered, white woman, intelligent, good education, like all of the things.
Educated, stable family.
I have all the things to benefit me. And so I didn't have to be in that brown edge. But I think as I've gotten older and exposed to more things, I become more aware of those edges and the people that need to be cared for outside of the irrigation system.
Yeah. And this Jesus that we follow, he always went to the edges.
Yeah.
It was the brown spots that he specialized in. Yeah.
One reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you today is because I've been in this series on church hurt, which ended up being much longer than I actually intended it to be, just because there are so many stories. Like you can't meet
Isn't that amazing?
A Christian without hearing a church hurt story, if you dig. And I was actually talking to one of my daughter's teachers, and he said something like, everybody's been hurt by the church, whether they're a Christian or not. And I was like, whoa, he's right, because even the people who have never set foot in a church still can tell you their experience of church hurt, which I'm sure many of the people in your congregation could tell you about. So when people are hurt by the church, often what happens is that they have to ask questions and they have to go through this process called deconstruction, because they see, okay, there's this Jesus in the Bible and he's this, this, and this. And then there's this church experience, which just doesn't line up, because how could I be so wounded if they're following this Jesus who's so loving? So sometimes what people do is have to break down some of the questions and traditions. And so that's a lot of times deconstruction is the logical consequence of church hurt. So I wanted you to come on and tell us, what is deconstruction?
No, it's such a good question. And, you're absolutely right about where it comes from in many cases. In some ways, I feel like I just want to start by normalizing it. Like one, like that whole, like the church hurting people. Well, relationships hurt. Like in my closest relationships in the world, right? Like we hurt each other. Like that's just, you can't put two people together and have them being honest, like in any kind of intimacy, and have them not hurt each other. But of course, we don't say that flippantly, like we don't care, right? We say it like, and then we try to learn, and we try to do better, and we try to figure out, how not to hurt. So similarly though, like we could actually kind of normalize the process of deconstruction and say like, this is actually how we learn. This is how we grow. This is how we develop. That process of like even discipleship, that like you and I, that was our context, right? That we first kind of met in, was this like, oh, how can we grow, intentionally? there's actually a really normal pathway and cycle for that, where you receive some truths. And at first you do it in this really it's easy, right? Like, so sometimes I talk about people with the metaphor of cooking, right? So I love teaching my kids how to cook.
Yeah.
And so the first thing you do with your kids, right? It's this stage one, what we call D1, sometimes discipleship one, is this very like, I'm doing it and I'm letting you watch. I do, you watch, right? And it's very simple and very black and white and easy. And we do that faith-wise too, right? Like, this is the Bible. This is how you read it. This is Jesus, and here's some truths. Jesus is the life. Jesus is the way. Very simple and easy. And people are usually very enthusiastic. Then it's actually normal to hit the stage where it gets harder, where we start saying, hey, I'm going to give some of this to you. You're actually going to have to crack the eggs, son. You're going to have to learn how to use some knife skills, like in the kitchen. Hey, now in the spiritual realm, like, we're going to start running into some questions. We're going to get hurt by people and have to wrestle it through. We're going to read something that didn't fit our previous worldview, right? And like, we're just going to have some questions. And it's actually a normal part of the maturing process to walk through that. The problem, I think, is when you don't realize that. When people are telling you like faith means not asking questions. Faith means don't doubt. Faith means stay in D1, where it's kind of safe and black and white, instead of like, no, this is what it means to grow up. And so I think that's actually where a lot of like the damage and the hurt comes from, is this feeling of like, I'm not allowed to ask questions. I don't know where to go with my questions. People treat me like I'm a heretic, or like I'm backsliding. I don't have faith if I ask questions. It actually ends up sort of pushing people. It compounds the hurt. It pushes them out, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And because I've heard from a lot of people, like people that I go to church with, they know that I have a seminary background and all of that. And so sometimes,
and it's nice to have someone with some seminary training.
Yeah. And sometimes I'll get a question from somebody who will say, hey, I tried to ask this of my pastor and I didn't get an answer.
Yeah.
Or I've been wrestling with this and I don't really know who to go to get answers for this. And they'll ask me, and of course, and maybe this is my therapy training too, is my response is not usually to give an answer, but to help people know how to find the answer.
It's so good, right? And so the difference, right? Like, that what they're probably telling you is not that, though, right? It's not just that, hey, my pastor challenged me to think for myself. My pastor offered to walk with me in the questions the way that you're offering. What they're saying is, my pastor was threatened by the questions, right? My pastor maybe didn't know the answer, or didn't like, that his answer, usually it's going to be his, was being challenged, questioned in some way. Because I'm with you, I still have people, usually from other contexts, right? So not, but sometimes it's just people who are kind of in the beginning stages of their deconstruction journey, and they'll come, and want me to give them the answer in something, or tell them if something is simple, something like that, and I'm like, man, those just aren't questions I ask anymore. Like, we can have an interesting conversation here. The last one, well, I probably shouldn't say the details, but anyway, just a question of something like, tell me if this is sin or not, just like, hey, let's have a broader conversation. Like, tell me what you're looking for as you think about this thing, and tell me how it operates in your life, and like, give me the story, right? And then I'd love to walk with you in the question as you actually connect with God, connect with Jesus. Right? Like, why am I the sin police? Why am I the answer person?
Because you're
right?
Like,
I think that's how we've defined the role of pastors. And even I think that's part of where the defensiveness comes from. The pastor thinks that's their job, instead of being able to like say, like, can I do it differently? Can I walk with you differently?
Well, that's like you were saying, it's kind of beautiful to have a small church where you can have the capacity to talk with people and actually know them, versus in a large church that a lot of times, like, I've never shaken my pastor's hand. I mean, we're at a new church. So previously we were really close to our pastors. In this context, I'm at a big church and I don't know him.
Mhm. And
So
sometimes that's nice, right? There are seasons where like
for
people
now.
actually go to a big church, sort of needing a little bit more distance,
Yes. And
right?
that's why we're there at this time in our lives.
Mhm.
But if I didn't know how to find the answers to questions or to how, I mean, sometimes it's not really even the answer, it's just being able to wrestle with it, then who would I go to? And that's what a lot of Christians
Yeah.
are up against.
Oh, I think so, right? Like, and that's what I think again, like the deconstruction journey, like if we could, if we, and again, I'm going to put myself back in the evangelical church, I think if we could embrace the questions, embrace the journey a little bit more, I think people would like, it just wouldn't hurt as much if we could say like, actually, this is a safe place for
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah.
Right. And like, we actually see that as like part of following Jesus and part of the faith journey. Anne Lamott has this great quote, and I'm not going to remember all of it, but she basically says the opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty. Certainty completely misses the point.
Yeah.
I love that, right? Because it's like faith has to have some room for questions and mystery. Like you can fit God into a box that you've made. Like, what kind of God is that?
It's not big enough for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Like I tell people all the time, like I'm a 1 Corinthians 13 kind of Christian. And I don't mean like the cheesy love passage. I mean the part at the end where it says like, now we see in a mirror dimly, then we shall see face to face. Like, can we not just admit we're seeing dimly?
Yeah.
We're seeing, but it, I mean, as we talk today, you're going to get stuff wrong and I'm going to get stuff wrong. And great. I think God's big enough to cover that.
Yeah.
But let's love together.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of times, just going back to this like progressive versus conservative reading of the Bible, I think that's what it comes down to, is because we read the same Bible, but we have different lenses and we interpret the scripture differently. And based on how you interpret the scripture, that's going to show you how you're going to live.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. But I actually love that you brought in the idea of lenses, because sometimes to me, like that's actually one of my bigger friendly critiques of evangelicalism, is that there can be this like sense of reading the scripture lens free, of just like, I can open up the Bible and just see what it means. And anybody else can do that too, versus acknowledging like we come in with lenses. And so we actually need to listen to other people with different lenses, so that together it's like that, the old fable of the blind men and the elephant, right? Of like, we're each seeing a different piece and we listen to each other to try and get a deeper understanding. Right.
And it's actually surprising that is hard to wrap our minds around, because when we read the Bible, like how many times have you been in a sermon where the pastor said, now this was an agricultural society and what you need to know about an agricultural society. And we go, oh yeah, we don't live on a farm now, so I don't maybe know what it's like to sow seed
get it.
field, and so we're already having to do that kind of translation from a different cultural experience to our own cultural experience, but then we don't necessarily account for people from different parts of the world, or people whose skin looks different from us, or whose family background is different than us. So
yeah, I mean, we just don't. Right. And like, for so many pastors going through seminary, even, right? Like you take theology classes and you take Bible classes, but the theology classes, there's theology 1, theology 2, theology 3. And then if you're really bold, and if you're one of those, controversial types, you might be able to find a small group of other people who are willing to read feminist theologies with you, or African-American theologies, liberation theologies. They're the ones with the adjectives, right? Because those are the ones that have lenses put to them. But theology 1, theology 2, and theology 3, those are the sort of unfiltered theology, right? Instead of saying, no, those are the white male Eurocentric theologies.
Bingo.
Right? Like we're not acknowledging our lenses. Yeah. So, I didn't grow up in a particular denomination. I am part of a denominational church right now and ordained through a denomination. But even that way, part of what I grew to love, I've grown to love, is this sort of like embodied in that is this acknowledgement of like, yeah, we're interpreting in a particular way, in a particular tradition, instead of just like the Bible said it, I believe it. Well, okay, what did the Bible say? And how did you get there? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So not to get into the weeds of theology. So you're defining deconstruction as a natural part of development and being able to ask questions about what you believe. Is there more to it?
Yeah. Okay. So let's think of a picture. I think about it sometimes with Lego sets. A friend this morning I was texting, and she was thinking more in terms of Jenga, and that's pretty good too.
Okay.
Right. So there's a sense that the first stage, right, is just this sort of building up, right? And you build this structure. I mean, this is the way knowledge kind of works. A lot of times in evangelical churches and evangelical theology, we do have this sense. I mean, I think even today we've used the word foundational, right? That you build in this sort of layer upon layer kind of way. And if you're thinking foundationally, it gets really like, if you start asking certain questions, you're worried that the whole structure is going to fall, right? So think about that Jenga tower, right? Like you have to be really, really careful. Like which brick am I going to pull out? And is the whole thing going to collapse? And sometimes it does work like that, right? Like people feel like, oh my gosh, like I pulled this wrong brick. And so the whole thing, I mean, the deconstruction was like a wrecking ball to my face. And so there's a reason that their loved ones from the side are going like, wow, it looks like they're really struggling. And it looks like deconstruction is horrible and awful, right? But I would suggest that deconstruction doesn't have to be that way. If from the beginning we said, hey, some remodeling is going to happen, like that this is just normal, you're going to build it, and sometimes you're just going to be able to like easily switch out some bricks, right? No big deal, right? No. And other times you're going to go, wow, this really isn't working for me. And I've got to make a more significant kind of effort where I'm going, all right, here are the pieces, which ones stay, where do I need to pull in some new bricks from some new sources, that it almost becomes more of a natural kind of like problem solving approach, right, with your faith. But if we don't tell people that in advance, and if some of us who haven't already kind of gone on the journey aren't around to give company, and to say like, it's okay, I know it's feeling like you're really stuck right here, but you got some interesting bricks there, right? Like let's keep going, it's all right. Another friend this morning said, hey, what I think people really miss about deconstruction is that it's only one step of the process. It's the one that gets all the buzz, this word of deconstruction. But the next phase is reconstruction. And I think the phase after that is where you realize that you're always going to be in that process, that there's always going to be a little bit of deconstruction and a little bit of reconstruction and a little bit of deconstruction, a little bit of reconstruction. Like that's actually just what growth is like. That's what learning is like.
Well, I was just thinking about the words we use, like the construction kind of words. They remind me, of building. And I was thinking there's a difference between deconstruction and demolition, right?
Yes. And a lot of people experience it as demolition.
Yes.
True,
and I think
don't have to.
That's what you're getting at, is that if you have somebody to kind of like accept you and walk through it with you and ask questions with you, you can do deconstruction like we do, like say when you're remodeling the bathroom, you're changing one small part of your house to make it better, but you're not like taking a wrecking ball to the whole house.
Yeah. Now, but let's extend that metaphor a little bit.
Okay.
What you will find though, right, is that once you finish that project in your bathroom, all of a sudden, like you're looking at your living room and going,
this needs updating.
Here, right? Like, so there is this ripple effect, which I think is a lovely thing, which I think is awesome. One other thing just to throw in there, let's shift metaphors, because here's another one, that this is one that I learned in seminary and I found really, really helpful, is like, what if there's an alternative completely to this building metaphor where it's like kind of this foundational picture, where here are root beliefs. And like I would say, like in evangelicalism, for instance, like inerrancy might be one of those, right? That we just say, here's the root and we can't.
And that would be a Jenga block for me,
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right. And a key one, like not like at top, but down at the bottom, where if you pull that thing out, right, the whole thing may crumble. This other picture that we could use would be a spider web. And with a spider web, it's a lot more flexible. Right? Like there's this resiliency to a spider web. And so with the spider web, instead of talking about a foundation, we might talk about a center, right? The center is where like the really, really important stuff is the stuff that you feel like this is like, I mean, this is key to how I understand the world, how I understand my faith. Like these are my core values or my core beliefs, right? And then there's a lot of other stuff around the edges that's a little bit more easy to negotiate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the further in we get to the center, like it's going to take more work to rearrange things, right? To like fix problems, if there's a hole there, but it's still possible. And the whole web isn't going to collapse every time, a new question kind of comes up, but you start with that center, right? And so I just find that really helpful sometimes to kind of say, hey, like, what are my centers? Yeah. Loving Jesus, loving people. And then there's a lot of like room to like weave and work and like figure out and listen to other people. And, it just to me sometimes feels like a more holistic and resilient picture of faith.
Okay, great. I want to, being mindful of time here, I want to ask you, because this podcast is about mental health as well as Christian faith, I want to ask you from either your own experience or the people that you've pastored along the way, what is the mental health impact of deconstruction?
Yeah. Well, first there's the loneliness piece. I think we've hit at that a little bit. And that sense of isolation, I can remember, it was probably at least 6 years ago now, as I was committing to entering in an intentional conversation around human sexuality, right, with my church. Okay. And sitting down and talking with a friend who I knew was much more theologically conservative than me. And she was like a sister to me. I mean, this was a deep friendship. And I just remember crying as I was talking to her and really just kind of saying, like, because this was the fear in my heart of like almost like coming out as someone who had questions around how the church related with LGBTQ people, and saying like, hey, if I become a flaming liberal, I think I said this, if I become a flaming liberal, will you still love me? And I think that's actually what a lot of people, when they start having their questions, they really do worry. And I don't think it's always unfounded. I mean, my friend that day was incredible. And she has walked with me and she still loves me, though I am probably, at least in some people's perspectives, a flaming like she loves me, right? And I love her. And we're making this relationship, this friendship work. But I do think, people have that question. And it's not coming from nowhere, in their experiences in the church. And that matters, because anything that we feel, I mean, this as the therapist, anything that's hidden becomes toxic, becomes full of shame, right? Like even things that actually shouldn't, don't have to be a big deal. Like if we feel like we have to hide it, there's a good chance, that it's going to become a place of damage and shame in our lives. So I think that's a major part of the mental health aspect of, like, if we think about it in terms of like grief, right? Like a grieving journey, I actually think people are grieving, the loss of maybe a more innocent faith, like a simpler faith. That's a good one. Yeah, a simpler faith. They're grieving the loss of that. They're grieving who they were when they held that faith. And so how do we walk with people in that grieving journey and make space for them to grieve and even just be transformed by that?
Yeah. And you mentioned the loneliness and isolation. And I would imagine in most areas of the country, it would be really hard to find people to walk with you through that. Yeah. Now, if you live in Southern California, there's some options, right?
Even here, not so many.
Yeah. But I imagine that feeling like you are the only person who has the questions and that you have to keep that hidden, you would grieve the loss of community as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You're like my story with my friend, right? You're worried about what it's going to mean for your relationships moving forward, right? Will every family holiday become awkward because you're holding things differently and you see things differently? And I'm like, what about all those friendships with your small group? If now you want to read different books, right?
In your experience, have you seen like anxiety or depression or some of these things become more prevalent among people who are going through this? I know you're not the therapist, I am, but
yeah.
have people talked about that?
That's a good question. I think there's like another question around just how the church talks about mental health. And that's actually sometimes part of people's church hurt that brings them into like deconstruction as well.
That's why we're here. That's why we're doing this podcast.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's why I love that you're doing this podcast, right? Because like, for instance, like I've had like a small group, where we were talking once and I started what I thought, and again, I could have sworn like this would have come out, it probably had like in smaller ways and they just hadn't registered it. But I was talking about my own struggles with anxiety, that I do have anxiety disorder. And I just thought I was talking, and I had these women responding like, I've never heard a pastor talk about their mental health before. I've never had a pastor acknowledge, right, that they have their own mental health struggles. And I was like, oh, let me start talking about that more, right? Like more explicitly. Maybe people, when I said anxiety, they thought I meant in like a casual way.
Like, I'm just worried.
Right. Yeah. Right. Like they didn't understand. Like I really meant, no, like off medication, like 2 miles before the left turn, I start praying, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's not normal. I mean, it's normal for an anxious person, perhaps with anxiety around driving. So I think really, yeah, I don't know that deconstruction is directly linked, to more struggles with anxiety or depression. I will say, I think anxiety and depression are linked to deconstruction in the sense of creating church hurt, that then people are going like, again, where is there space for me to come with? People just want to be able to come to church with all of who they are, to be able to come honestly with their intellectual questions around how to read the Bible. They want to be able to come with their social justice concerns, right? And they want to be able to come with all of the little quirks and struggles that make them human.
And their full range of emotions.
Their full range of emotions. Yeah. Yeah. Our most recent sermon was about gratitude and toxic positivity.
Oh, thank you.
Like, how do you wrestle between those? Yeah. Yeah. Because, and it was such a good conversation, right? There's so much to tease out there.
Yeah.
Right.
There is. And that could be a whole another conversation.
Right. But so in this case, just to say, like, I think deconstruction, I mean, it's all these different sources, but we want to be able to come with our full selves, all of our emotions, all of our questions, all of our hopes, and for the church to make space for that. And I mean, I would love to see the evangelical church doing that better. Like a lot of times, like it feels very much like our church is doing a lot of triage, right? Like just kind of, we're trying to create a lot of space for people who feel damaged.
Yeah.
And just trying to create space for the healing journey.
Yeah. So in the same way, I mean, we're both healers and helpers in that way, that's why people come to see me too. Like,
right.
They want to know that I have a foundation of belief in Jesus.
Yeah.
But they also need a space where they can drop F-bombs if they want to. And
they
can cry and ugly cry, and they can rant, and they can say their deepest, darkest secrets, and that I'm just going to be there for the ride.
Totally. I mean, it's very similar, I'm sure. Like, with people, they're just wondering if they're going to shock you, and instead say, no, this feels like a very normal experience. And and I think in a similar way, I mean, we're very clear that we're a Jesus-centered church, that we love Jesus. We actually love scripture. Preach from it every Sunday. And we're going to create all the space you need to decide for yourselves. But clearly there's something about Jesus, like that, I mean, people, they wouldn't come to our church if they didn't sort of appreciate and want, that connection that we have. And that we're kind of, I think in some ways trying to create that safe space. Like, let us provide a safe space for you to legitimately go on your journey. And we're not gonna predetermine or, presuppose, where you're going to end up at the end. We just have a lot of faith and trust in you and in the God who loves you.
Yeah. I know you have a new project, and would you like to just share briefly about that and how people can find you if they're interested?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. My co-pastor, Bill White, and I have started a new nonprofit in development called Small Church, Big Table. And it's really just, especially trying to be a spot for leaders, using that term very broadly. People who love and are passionate about the church. I say that a little bit in quote marks, right? Because many of us have kind of a complicated relationship with church. But yeah, leaders who love Jesus and are trying to figure out how to create kind of wider spaces where hopefully we maybe do a little bit less damage. That we create these kinds of communities for people where people can show up with their full selves. And we think especially a lot about leadership, having had, just so many conversations with other leaders, many of whom still would describe as evangelical, right? Who are just trying to figure out, like, what do they do with their questions? Like, where are their safe spaces to come and to wrestle through and to say, hey, I'm not sure the way I've been taught is the way I want to move forward, right? Like, what if I want to do it differently? Yeah. What might that look like?
That must be incredibly scary from a pastoral position to think, like, I have questions, and if I don't get this right, I lose my livelihood, do I still have a calling? Like, all of those things.
When you're a pastor, I mean, in some ways it's awesome, right? Your life is very integrated, your relationships and your job and your passions, and that can be great. But yeah, think about when you start to have some questions and some doubts, it means you're threatening all of that. And I really feel for so many pastors, because I think so many more are wrestling with those questions. Some of them, I think, who even really have made what they feel like they have to say on a Sunday and what they actually are thinking, what they actually believe is different. And that's a very difficult.
That does not feel integrated, does it?
Yeah, disintegrated was exactly the word I was thinking about. But what do they do? And what does it look like to love your church? Do you love your church by asking your questions out loud when they've always expected you to be the answer people and they want you to share particular answers? Is that loving your church? Or do you just leave with your questions so you don't bother people? Yeah. Right? What do you do?
And that hurts too.
Yeah. So pastors are in a really tricky spot right now.
So on the Small Church Big Table, you have a website and you are sharing some blogs and other resources. You have a workshop, I think.
So yes, we have a workshop coming up on November 17th called Lead Without Being an A-hole. Okay. Which is about these different postures that leaders in the church can take towards leadership. And I mean, if anybody's curious about it, there's actually kind of like a free 5-page guide that we created with, I think, kind of a fun visual. I like the visuals to kind of get you started and processing. Cool. So yeah.
Good. Your church website is...
Yeah, it's all linked through my Instagram. I've got a link tree up there. So City Church of Long Beach, if anybody would like to look for it. And I wish there were more places for people who are in this spot and having questions. But, some of the resources, you'd invited me, I think, in the Calendly form to share. I listed one blog that we wrote and a couple others, and I'm thinking this isn't just for people who are actively deconstructing. This is if somebody you love would say that they're deconstructing. Yeah. You want to be curious about what their experience is like. Yeah. Like, here are some resources, that maybe could give you a little insight into their work.
The same, like what you said about your churches, people, like, maybe you're in the LGBTQ community, or maybe you love someone who is, and so that's maybe the same for deconstruction, that maybe you're deconstructing, or maybe you love someone and you have some questions about what is this journey that they just launched on.
And how would I walk alongside them well? Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm going to include some of those links in the show notes. And before we wrap up, let me ask you, what are you doing for soul care?
So I just blocked out next Wednesday so that I will have no appointments. And my plan is to have all of my electronics shut down so that I can have, a silent prayer, rest, relaxation, not being on, just being human kind of day. One of the things I've been talking a lot with my therapist, who I see like once a month, just to help me kind of stay current. It's one of my spiritual practices to see my therapist once a month. And we just talked a lot about embracing my limits, right? Like I had this really profound moment during the pandemic where I was thinking about Genesis and shalom. So kind of like our original kind of like who we are created to be, who we're going to be reformed into again, right? This kind of renewal process. And I just had this light bulb moment that even in the very beginning, like before the fall, before any sin or damage or anything, I would still have been limited, right? If the fall and sin had never entered the world, I would still be limited.
Yeah.
Like limits are different than sin, right? Like my creatureliness is a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
But I have trouble living into that, right? I have to practice it deliberately to say, like, I have hit the limits of my creatureliness and I need rest. I need renewal. I need silence.
Yeah. So you're taking a silent day.
I'm taking a silent day. I'm really looking forward to it.
Okay. And going to therapy once a month.
Yes, that's also huge.
Gold star for mentioning that.
Yeah, a little plug.
Yeah.
So we need the therapist. The pastors need the therapist too.
Yeah, that's great. So, well, I just really appreciate you being here to kind of wrap up this series and to even just to come from a place of understanding what it's like to be hurt and that there is just a wealth of options if you have been hurt, that it's not the end of the road for you.
Yeah. And your faith journey isn't over. This is actually a normal part of it.
Yeah.
And you've been so fun to talk with. I've really enjoyed this.
I enjoyed having you too. And you're so wise and so gentle. I appreciate that and love your family. So thanks for being here.
We love you too, Anne. You know, Israel said hi and yeah.
Fun
to
The Soul Grit podcast is a production of Soul Grit Resources. You can find more at soulgritresources.com or on the socials at Soul Grit Resources. You can email me at info@soulgritresources.com.